in this video, I'm going to be talking about the difference between asynchronous versus synchronous. And by learning the difference between both of them, you will actually understand what actually asynchronous and what actually synchronous mean in computer programming. So let's just first cover what actually is synchronous in programming. So synchronicity in programming happens when the execution of operations is done sequentially. So an operation will only be executed after the previous one is done. This means that a potential complex task may take a while before all its steps are executed and completed. So synchronous tasks are done in a single thread. So just imagine, let's just understand synchronous programming with an example, and just imagine that when a person is alone preparing a meal, they will have to do all the tasks by themselves, and some steps require food processed in previous steps. Well, you can rearrange the order slightly, but some steps have a fixed order. Like for example, you can only mince a carrot after you have unpeeled it. That is quite obvious one. And now let's just understand what actually is asynchronous. So asynchronous processing is done in parallel. Means that in asynchronous, multiple tasks are actually happening in parallel, or you can just say at the same time. So since tasks are not dependent on others, so they can be actually executed at the same time as one main process or operation. So each asynchronous task is done in a different thread that reports back to the main thread with the result when it is actually completed. So all the tasks in asynchronous report back the result when they are done. And again, let's just understand asynchronous by having the same example. So let's just say that you add another cook to the kitchen that will allow you more time efficiency. So for example, when one person is taking care of chopping vegetable, another person can start making the sauce. And let's just say that you add another cook as well, who can prepare the meat while the other two are working as well, and so on. Now there are some steps that needs to happen in sequence. The summary of the dish after every ingredient is prepared is an obvious one, but others can be carried out independently to speed up the process. So I hope that you now have understood the difference between synchronous and asynchronous programming. Well, actually, you will understand the difference between both of them more accurately once we move on to the coding part of asynchronous programming. But now, since you have understood the basic difference between synchronous and asynchronous programming, my question to you is that is JavaScript synchronous or asynchronous? So just pause this video for a while and just think about it. Okay, so let me just answer this question. So by default, JavaScript is actually synchronous. That is, each task in JavaScript is executed sequentially, means that the second task cannot be executed after the previous one is done. Means that, in other words, I can just say that the third or fourth line of code cannot be executed before the first and second line of code. So that is why JavaScript by default is synchronous, but actually we make JavaScript asynchronous with callbacks, promises, async await, and other built-in functionalities in JavaScript. So I hope now well, actually this question will actually make more sense once we actually move on to the coding part of asynchronous programming. And I'm going to basically show you the synchronous and asynchronous examples once we move on to the coding part. I will be coding an example of synchronous programming. So let's just say that I will have some console.log like 5 or 6 times. And in here, let me just add a space right here and then just copy it. So copy, and then let's just say I'll just paste it 3, 4, and then 5 times. And in here, let's just say that I'll just say that 5, and then in here I'll just say I am making an ice cream. Okay. So I am making an ice cream. Okay, so now just save it. And since we are just running it on our console screen. So to open your console screen, if you're using VS Code, just simply click right here, and then just click here terminal. And now since you want to run script.js, just simply type node and then script init.js, hit enter, and you can see that we're actually seeing this output. I am making an ice cream. So you're seeing that it first of all executed this line of code, and then this line of code, and this one, and then this one, and then this one, because JavaScript is actually running the code from the top to the bottom. So let's just say that if there is some problem, let's just say with this line of code, then the entire execution will stop. So this is an example of synchronous programming, that is the code is actually running from the top to the bottom. That is, this line of code cannot be executed before this line of code, because JavaScript is actually executing it sequentially from the top to the bottom. So let's just say that I've just I just changed the order. So let's just say that I just add this thing right here. And now this sentence is actually not making sense. I am ice cream making an, but if I just save it and run it again, the save script file, you can just see that JavaScript doesn't care. It is saying I am ice cream making an, because JavaScript doesn't care what actually I'm executing. JavaScript doesn't care that if I have to make sense as well. It doesn't care about this thing. It just simply execute the code from the top to the bottom sequentially. That is, this line of code cannot be executed before these lines of code, and then similarly, this line of code cannot be executed after these lines of code. The code will be executed synchronously, one after the other. So now you can just say that by default, actually JavaScript is synchronous. So in here, let me just add a comment right here and just say that this is actually an example of synchronous programming. Okay, so this one is an example of synchronous programming in which the code is executed one after the other sequentially. Okay, so now in the next video, we'll just do an example of asynchronous programming. Okay, let's have an example of asynchronous programming. So in here we have console.log 5 times. So it is saying that I eat ice cream with a spoon. Okay, so now let's just say that we will add a setTimeout function, which is an asynchronous JavaScript function. So now right in here, I'll just say that set timeout function. And now in here, the first thing that will pass out is a function, will be basically an arrow function, and this arrow function will be executed after, let's just say, after a certain amount of time. And let's just say that it will be executed after 4 seconds. So it actually takes a time in millisecond. So this 4000 actually means 4 seconds. Now for the first argument, we'll pass a function, and this function will be an arrow function. So now right in here, we'll just pass an arrow function. And now for this arrow function, let's just say that it will actually execute this line of code. So I'm going to basically cut it right from here, and I'll just paste it right here. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is that let's just say that I will just add it right here. So now just save your code. Okay, so now what I'm actually doing is that I'm just saying that I eat, and I'm just adding a setTimeout function, which will actually execute this line of code, which is ice cream. So I eat, and then with setTimeout function, I'm just adding console.log ice cream, and then console.log with a spoon. Okay, so now let's just first of all see how it will be executed. So now just save your script, and now let's just execute it by just saying that node and then the name of this file, which is script.js. Okay, now hit enter. Okay, so it's saying that I eat with a spoon, because we have instructed JavaScript that this line of code will be executed, this function, that this whole function will be executed after 4 seconds, and after 4 seconds it actually says that it is an ice cream. Okay, so now how actually this whole thing is working behind the scene. So for this, I have this thing in my notepad. Okay, so basically this whole thing is actually, this whole program, this whole JavaScript program is actually a main process, or you can just call it as a main lane. So first of all, in the main lane, it executed this line of code, I, and then it says say eat, and then since it is an asynchronous call, so what JavaScript will do is that it will actually create a new thread, which will actually be the part of this main thread, but it will be executed separately. So what JavaScript will do is that it will actually take this whole thing, basically this whole setTimeout function, and then we'll put it in a separate lane. So in the separate lane, this thing will be executing while the main thread will be executing parallelly, parallel to basically this a small thread. So since it will take 4 seconds while the main thread is executing as well, so it will continue to say with a spawn, and then after, let's just say after 4 seconds, when this process has actually been executed, then what it will do is that it will actually report back the result to the main lane or to the main process. So in here, first of all, it executed I, and then we just printed out it, and then we just added an asynchronous function, which will actually move to the separate lane or a small thread, which will actually be the part of this main thread or this main program. So it will be executing at the same time, while in parallel, our main lane will also be running. So since it will take 4 seconds, it will then report back once it is completely completed. So, and then it will say with a spawn, and then after 4 seconds, this line of code will be executed. So it will actually report back, and then you will just see this result right here. Okay, so let me just execute this code once again. So this thing, and then this whole thing is executed while the small thread is not yet been executed. And now it has been completed after 4 seconds, and it has actually reported back with this result, basically this whole function. Okay, so I hope that you now have understood this set timeout function and how actually how it is actually working in an asynchronous mode. So this was an example of asynchronous programming.